What would you do if the world ended twice and both times you walked away? Not a movie, not a made-up story. This actually happened to one man in the same week, in the same war. On the same planet you are living on right now. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. And the universe, for reasons no scientist has ever fully explained, chose him to survive not one but two atomic bombs. Let that sink in. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in war. It fell on Hiroshima. It killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. Entire city blocks vanished in seconds. The blast flattened everything within miles. Yamaguchi was there. He survived. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. It killed another 40,000 people instantly. The fire, the pressure wave, the radiation, all of it came roaring through the city like a wall of death. Yamaguchi was there too. He survived again. The odds of this are almost impossible to calculate. Scientists and mathematicians have tried. They have no clean answer. Some call it luck. Some call it fate. Some call it something they do not have a word for. But surviving was only the beginning of his story. Because what came after, the nightmares, the guilt, the silence, the government that refused to believe him, the decades of suffering nobody saw, that is the part history books leave out. That is the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. Today you are going to learn the full story, not just the facts, not just the dates. You are going to understand what it actually felt like to be the only man on Earth who witnessed two atomic blasts up close and lived to talk about it. And at the end of this video, you are going to hear the one thing Yamaguchi said before he died. A message so simple and so powerful that it stopped a room full of people completely silent. Stay until the end. It is worth it. This is the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the man the universe could not kill. Before we talk about the bombs, we need to talk about the man. It is easy to reduce Yamaguchi to a statistic. The double survivor, the miracle man, but he was not a statistic. He was a person. He had a life. He had a family. He had dreams that had nothing to do with war or bombs or death. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was born on March 16, 1916, in Nagasaki, Japan. He grew up in a country modernizing at extraordinary speed. Old traditions were bumping into new technology every single day. He was a quiet, focused kid. He kept his head down and worked hard. Those values stayed with him his entire life. He became a marine engineer. He worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, one of the most powerful companies in Japan. Mitsubishi built ships, big ones. It was serious, technical work. And Yamaguchi was good at it. By 1945, he was 29 years old. He was married to a woman named Hisako. They had a young son. He was not a soldier. He was not a fighter. He was just an engineer trying to do his job and get home to his family. That is important to remember. He did not choose to be in Hiroshima. His job sent him there. In the spring of 1945, Mitsubishi assigned him to a 3-month work trip to Hiroshima. The company was designing a new oil tanker. He packed his bags, said goodbye to Hisako and his son, and made the journey. By early August, his assignment was nearly done. A few more days and he would be on a train home. August 6, 1945 was supposed to be one of his last days in Hiroshima. He woke up like any other morning. He headed to the shipyard. The sky was clear. The sun was bright. It was a warm summer morning in a city that had no idea it was about to cease to exist. In the summer of 1945, the United States had a secret. For years, the greatest scientific minds in the world had been working on something called the Manhattan Project. What they had built had never existed before in human history: an atomic bomb. A weapon that used nuclear fission to release an almost incomprehensible amount of energy in a single instant. The scientists who built it knew it would be devastating. But even they did not fully understand what it would look like when it went off over a real city full of real people. On the morning of August 6, 1945, they were about to find out. And so was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. At 8:15 in the morning, the sky over Hiroshima turned white, not bright, not glowing, white. A blinding, total, all-consuming white that swallowed everything in an instant. Survivors described it the same way over and over. They said it was like the sun had fallen from the sky and landed in the middle of the city. That is almost exactly what it was. Little Boy detonated approximately 580 meters above the ground. That height was chosen deliberately. Exploding above ground meant the blast wave spread outward in all directions, maximizing destruction across a wider area. The temperature at the center reached between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. At the epicenter, people simply ceased to exist, vaporized in less than a second. The blast wave followed the heat at supersonic speed. It flattened buildings like paper. Entire neighborhoods erased in seconds. Then came the fires, thousands of them, all at once, merging into a firestorm that consumed everything the blast had not already destroyed. Within the first few minutes, between 70,000 and 80,000 people were dead. By year-end, between 90,000 and 140,000. One bomb, one city, one morning. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was approximately 3.5 kilometers from the epicenter. He had just stepped off a streetcar and was walking through a potato field when he saw a glowing point in the sky that suddenly expanded into something he had no words for. His instincts kicked in. He dove to the ground and covered his eyes with his hands. It saved his life. The heat wave passed over him. The blast threw him into the air. He blacked out. When he woke up, the world was unrecognizable. Everything was dark, not nighttime dark, dark like the inside of a box. Then the sounds came back, screaming, the crackling of fires, the groaning of collapsing buildings. His burns were severe. His left face, left arm, and upper body had been badly burned. His eardrums were ruptured. His hair was burned off, but he was standing. He was breathing. He was alive. He looked around and could barely process what he saw. The city was gone, not damaged, gone. People were wandering in a daze, their skin hanging off their arms in strips. He saw a line of people walking in complete silence. Their arms stretched out in front of them, keeping the melting skin from touching anything. They were not screaming, just walking, quietly. In a line, he joined them. He eventually reached an air raid shelter. He spent the night surrounded by the burned and broken and terrified. Nobody knew what had happened. There had never been anything like this in human history. After a few days, he recovered just enough strength to move. And then he made a decision. He decided to go home. His home was in Nagasaki. He did not know he was heading directly toward the exact spot where history was about to repeat itself. He thought the worst was behind him. He was wrong. Put yourself in his shoes. You have survived something that killed tens of thousands around you. Your face is burned. Your ears are damaged. You can barely hear. The city you lived in for 3 months is a smoking ruin. There is no food, no clean water, almost no medical help. What do you do? For Yamaguchi, the answer was simple. Get home, get back to Isako, see his son. Everything inside him pulled in one direction, Nagasaki. Getting out of Hiroshima was not simple. Roads were blocked by rubble. Bridges were damaged. He made the walk anyway, burned, bandaged, half-deaf, picking through ruins that looked like the surface of the moon. On the long train ride to Nagasaki, he sat wrapped in bandages, his burns throbbing, watching the countryside pass outside the window. Other passengers were quiet. In Japan, in that moment in that war, you kept your pain to yourself and kept moving. Yamaguchi kept moving. When he arrived home, the reunion with Hisako was overwhelming. She saw her husband come through the door looking like he had walked through hell. She saw the burns. She heard his damaged hearing. She understood immediately that something catastrophic had happened. He told her everything. The flash, the blast, the burned city, the silent people with their arms stretched out. He tried to find words for something that had no words. She listened. She cleaned his wounds. She made sure he rested. He rested at home for 3 days. But he was a man with a job and a sense of duty. Mitsubishi was still operating. Japan had not surrendered. Life was expected to continue. So on August 9, 1945, 3 days after surviving the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, Tsutomu Yamaguchi went back to work. He stood in front of his supervisor and gave his report. He described what had happened in Hiroshima. He told him about the single bomb. He told him about the blinding flash and the citywide destruction. One bomb, just one, had done all of that. His supervisor looked at him like he had lost his mind. He could not believe it. A single bomb wiping out an entire city? That was not possible. He told Yamaguchi he must be exaggerating. That the stress had affected his thinking. Yamaguchi stood there, burned and bandaged, and tried to make him understand. And then, at 11:02 in the morning, the argument became irrelevant. Because the sky outside turned white again. The same white. The same total, blinding white that Yamaguchi had seen 3 days earlier over Hiroshima. The same flash that he recognized immediately in a way that nobody else in that room could. Nobody else except him. In that fraction of a second, Tsutomu Yamaguchi threw himself to the floor. The blast wave hit the building. The windows shattered, the walls cracked, the ceiling buckled. When the chaos settled, Yamaguchi was on the floor, alive, again. His supervisor looked at him from across the destroyed room. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Outside, Nagasaki was burning. The bomb that fell on Nagasaki was called Fat Man. It was a plutonium bomb, different from the uranium bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. In raw explosive power, Fat Man was actually stronger, carrying roughly 40% more destructive force than Little Boy. And yet Nagasaki lost fewer lives than Hiroshima. The reason was geography. Nagasaki is built into hills and valleys. The surrounding ridges absorbed some of the blast energy and limited how far the destruction spread. Without those hills, the death toll would have been unimaginable. But make no mistake, what happened on August 9, 1945 was still one of the most devastating events in human history. The bomb detonated at 11:02 in the morning, approximately 500 meters above the ground. The initial blast killed an estimated 40,000 people instantly. By the end of 1945, that number had risen to between 60,000 and 80,000. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was inside a building approximately 3 kilometers from the epicenter when it happened. Almost exactly the same distance he had been from the epicenter in Hiroshima. The universe had placed him twice within the same deadly radius of 2 separate atomic explosions in 2 different cities 3 days apart. The statistical probability of this is staggering. Researchers have struggled to put a clean number on it. Some have simply described it as an event so improbable that it exists at the outer boundary of what statistics can meaningfully address. When the flash came and Yamaguchi threw himself to the floor, the building took the hit around him. The windows blew inward, the walls cracked. The heat wave pushed through the broken windows and passed over him where he lay on the floor. He survived. Again, but this time was different. This was his city. His wife and son were out there in that burning landscape. The moment he could move, he ran. Through destroyed streets, through smoke and rubble and screaming confusion, toward his home. Toward Hisako, toward his son. His house was damaged, but it was standing. And inside, Hisako and his son were alive. They had survived. Standing in the ruins of his damaged home, burned and half-deaf and trembling, Tsutomu Yamaguchi held his family and understood that he had survived 2 atomic bombs. But the physical survival was only one part of what was happening to his body. The invisible part was already underway: radiation. Both bombs had bathed him in ionizing radiation, energy that passes through the human body and damages cells at the molecular level. In the days that followed, he ran a high fever. He vomited repeatedly. His hair fell out in clumps. His white blood cell count dropped dangerously low. He was experiencing acute radiation syndrome. And yet slowly his body pulled back from the edge. The fever broke. The vomiting eased. Against every medical expectation, he recovered. The war ended on August 15. Japan surrendered. For most people, it meant relief. For Yamaguchi, it meant something more complicated. He was alive in a world that had just witnessed something it had never witnessed before. He was one of the only people on Earth who had seen it, not once but twice. What do you do with that? How do you go back to being a normal person after experiencing something no other human being in history has experienced? How do you close your eyes without seeing the white flash again? These were not rhetorical questions. Yamaguchi spent decades trying to answer them. The bombs stopped falling. The war ended. The world moved on. Tsutomu Yamaguchi did not. What he carried after August 1945 was not just physical scars and damaged hearing. It was something much deeper, something that lived inside him every single day. The Japanese word hibakusha means explosion-affected person. It was used to describe atomic bomb survivors. There were hundreds of thousands of hibakusha in post-war Japan. Yamaguchi was a hibakusha twice over, a niju hibakusha, a category so rare that for decades most people did not believe it could exist. The psychological damage started immediately. The images he had seen in both cities were not fading. They were sharp and vivid, surfacing at random moments with a force that knocked the breath out of him. The line of silent people walking with their arms stretched out. The shadows burned into the concrete. The darkness that swallowed both cities. The moaning. The fires. These images came in dreams. They came in waking moments. They came when he thought he had pushed everything down deep enough that it could not reach him. It always reached him. What Yamaguchi was experiencing had no official name in 1945. The concept of PTSD was not recognized or treated at that time. In Japanese culture, the expectation was to endure, to be strong, to move forward without complaint. So Yamaguchi did what the culture expected. He pushed it down. He went back to work. He tried to be a husband and father. He put one foot in front of the other every single day. But the cost of that silence was enormous. Survivor's guilt is a brutal form of psychological suffering. The constant, unanswerable question, why me? For most survivors of trauma, it is painful enough. For Yamaguchi, it was compounded in ways almost impossible to process. He had not survived one mass death event. He had survived two. He had walked away from two mornings that collectively killed over 100,000 people in the first hours alone. He said in later years that for a very long time he could not understand why he was still alive, that it felt wrong, that it felt like a mistake. There was also social stigma, serious, crushing, damaging stigma. Hibakusha were not treated as heroes in post-war Japan. They were treated with fear and avoidance. People were afraid they were still radioactive, that their blood was contaminated. None of this was scientifically accurate, but fear does not require accuracy to do damage. Hibakusha found it difficult to get jobs, difficult to get married. They were whispered about, looked at differently. The social isolation on top of physical and psychological suffering was devastating. It turned survival into something that sometimes felt more like punishment than blessing. So Yamaguchi stayed quiet. For decades, he did not talk publicly about surviving 2 atomic bombs. He raised his children. He rebuilt his life in the only way available, by keeping moving and keeping quiet. The images never left. What kept him going, by his own account in later years, was simple. His family, Hisako. His children, the daily, ordinary, irreplaceable reality of people who needed him to still be there. He did not feel like a miracle. He felt like a husband and father trying very hard to hold himself together for the people who depended on him. That was enough, just barely enough, but enough. Imagine surviving 2 atomic bombs. Carrying that inside you for years. Doing it in silence, without complaint, without asking for anything. And then imagine that the government of your own country looks at everything you have been through and says, "We do not believe you." That is what happened to Tsutomu Yamaguchi. To understand it, you need to understand post-war Japan. The country had lost the war. It was under American occupation. Its political system was being rebuilt under American supervision. Its economy was shattered. It needed to rebuild fast. The American occupation authorities imposed strict censorship on information about the atomic bombs. Reports about their effects, the suffering of survivors, all of it was tightly controlled. Journalists were blocked from reporting on conditions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Research findings about radiation were suppressed. Film footage was confiscated. The official American position was that the bombs had been necessary to end the war. Allowing uncensored reporting on their human cost would complicate that narrative. This censorship lasted until 1952, 7 years after the bombs fell. For 7 years, the Japanese public had only a partial picture of what had happened. But even after censorship lifted, the Japanese government did not become a champion for atomic bomb survivors. The first legislation aimed at helping Hibakusha did not come until 1957, 12 years after the bombs. And gaining official recognition required navigating complicated bureaucratic processes while already dealing with illness, poverty, and psychological trauma. Records had been destroyed. Witnesses had died. Many survivors who had genuinely been there could not provide the paperwork required. For Yamaguchi, the situation was even more complicated. He was not claiming to have survived 1 bomb. He was claiming to have survived 2 in 2 different cities, 3 days apart. That claim was met with profound skepticism. The concept of a double survivor was so far outside normal experience that bureaucrats simply did not know how to handle it. Some officials questioned him directly, not gently, not with sympathy, but with the blunt skepticism of people who found his story implausible. How could someone have been in Hiroshima and then in Nagasaki? The timing seemed too extraordinary. This is the particular cruelty of his situation. The very thing that made his story remarkable, its sheer improbability, was the thing that made it hardest for authorities to accept. He was recognized as a Nagasaki survivor for many years. His experience in Hiroshima was not formally acknowledged. He existed in official records as a man who had survived one bomb, when the truth was he had survived two. For a man as private and quietly dignified as Yamaguchi, this official disbelief was deeply painful. He had spent decades keeping his experience inside, carrying his burden without complaint. To finally step forward and say, "This is what happened to me," and be told it was too extraordinary to believe was a specific kind of wound. Japan's post-war identity was built around being the only nation to experience nuclear attack, a symbol of the need for peace and disarmament. That narrative had real political value. But it required treating the atomic bomb story as national symbolism rather than individual human suffering. The hibakusha were symbols when symbols were useful. They were bureaucratic problems when their actual needs required addressing. It was not until 2009, 64 years after the bombs fell, that the Japanese government formally recognized Tsutomu Yamaguchi as a Niju hibakusha, the only person in Japanese government records to hold that designation. He was 93 years old, 64 years, waiting for someone in authority to say, "Yes, we believe you, we see you. We acknowledge it, it should not have taken 64 years. It was not just a paperwork failure, it was a moral failure. A failure of a government to look its own survivors in the eye and acknowledge what they had lived through. But Yamaguchi did not let bitterness consume him. He had every right to be bitter. Instead, he chose something more difficult and more valuable. He chose to speak. Silence has a weight to it, not the comfortable silence of a quiet evening. The kind Yamaguchi carried for decades was different. It was the silence of something enormous pressing down from the inside, something that wanted to come out but had nowhere safe to go. For most of his adult life, he did not speak publicly about what he had experienced. He went to work. He raised his family. He lived inside his private world of memories and nightmares and pain. The outside world did not know his name. He was just a man in Nagasaki with a story almost nobody knew he was carrying. That began to change slowly. In the 1970s and 1980s, he began speaking in small ways within his family and within small circles he trusted. Something in him was starting to understand that the silence was not protecting him anymore. It was just isolating him. His children were part of that shift. As they grew older, they encouraged him to talk. They sat with him and listened. For a man who had spent decades keeping his experience sealed away, being asked to share it by people who loved him was something new. It created a space that had not existed before. But the real shift was driven by something larger than personal healing. It was driven by fear of the future. By the time Yamaguchi was in his 70s and 80s, the world had accumulated tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. The Cold War had ended, but the weapons had not gone with it. Russia, the United States, China, the United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan, all had nuclear arsenals. The threat had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape and spread to more corners of the world. Yamaguchi watched all of this. And something in him, the part that had seen with his own eyes what a single atomic bomb does to a real city full of real people, could not stay silent. He had been standing close enough to feel the heat on his skin. He had walked through the ruins. He had smelled what a city smells like after a nuclear explosion. He was perhaps the only person alive who had experienced all of that not once, but twice. And the people making decisions about nuclear weapons had experienced none of it. They talked about them as tools of power, as bargaining chips, as abstractions. Yamaguchi knew they were not abstractions. And that knowledge, that specific physical first-hand knowledge, was something he understood he had a responsibility to share. So he started talking, publicly, in his own quiet, measured way. He gave interviews. He participated in documentary projects. He described what he had seen in both cities. He described what surviving had cost him and his family. He did not shout or perform outrage. He spoke quietly and precisely, choosing his words with care. He simply described what he had seen and let the facts speak for themselves. The facts were more than enough. He published a memoir. He became involved in the Hibakusha advocacy movement. He was invited to speak at the United Nations, a quiet engineer from Nagasaki, standing in one of the most powerful political chambers in the world, speaking to the representatives of nations that had built and dropped the bombs that had defined his entire life. He told them about the flash, about the silence that followed, about the burned people walking in lines with their arms stretched out, about the radiation sickness, about his wife's suffering, about the shadow the bombs had cast over his children and grandchildren. He called for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Not reduction, not limitation. Elimination, all of them, every one. The room listened. Whether the room acted on what it heard is a different question. The world still has nuclear weapons. The debates continue, complicated and slow, but Yamaguchi spoke. And his speaking mattered, to the Hibakusha community, to historians and journalists and filmmakers, to ordinary people around the world who heard his story and understood, perhaps for the first time in a visceral and immediate way, what nuclear weapons actually mean in human terms. He had broken his silence just in time, because by 2009 his body was failing. The stomach cancer was advancing, but he had said what he needed to say. He had done what he needed to do. He had taken the experience he had kept sealed inside for most of his life and brought it out into the world where it could mean something beyond his own private suffering. There is a particular kind of peace that comes to some people at the end of a very long and very hard life, not the peace of having had things easy. The peace of someone who has carried an enormous weight for a very long time and has finally found a way to set it down, just enough to breathe. By the final years of his life, Tsutomu Yamaguchi had found something close to that peace. He was old, he was sick. The atomic radiation he had absorbed in both cities had done its slow, invisible work over decades. Cataracts, hearing damage, recurring illnesses. And now stomach cancer, a condition consistently linked to radiation exposure in atomic bomb survivors. He was also nearly blind. The cataracts had severely damaged his vision. The man who had seen 2 atomic flashes with his own eyes was losing his sight in his final years. There is a painful symmetry in that which does not require elaboration. But even in those final years, diminished in body and running out of time, Yamaguchi retained the qualities that had always defined him. The quietness, the dignity, the refusal to dramatize. The precision with which he spoke about what he had experienced. The fundamental decency of a man who had been through extraordinary things and had come through them without losing his essential humanity. His wife, Hisako, died in 2008. She had been his partner through everything, through the bombs, the radiation sickness, the decades of health problems, the social stigma, the silence, and then the speaking. She had cleaned his burns when he came home from Hiroshima. She had survived Nagasaki alongside him. She had been the quiet, steady presence at the center of his life for over 6 decades. Losing her in his final years, when his own health was already failing, was a grief that sat alongside all the other griefs he carried. In 2009, 1 year after Hisako's death, the Japanese government officially recognized him as a Niju Hibakusha, the formal acknowledgement that had taken 64 years to arrive. He was 93 years old. He accepted it without fanfare, with the measured, quiet dignity that had always been his way. Those close to him said it meant something. That being officially seen, even after all that time, carried real weight. He died on January 4, 2010. He was 93. He had been born in 1916, in a Japan still decades away from the war that would define his life. He had lived through the entire arc of the 20th century. He had seen Japan modernize, militarize, go to war, be defeated, be occupied, and rebuild itself into one of the most prosperous nations on earth. And through all of it, he had carried those 2 mornings in August with him, every single day. His death was reported around the world. For many people, it was the first time they had heard his name. The first time they understood that one human being had been inside both explosions, had lived through both of them, and had gone on to live a full and meaningful life. His legacy operates on several levels simultaneously. On the personal level, it lives in his family. His children and grandchildren carry his story with them. They carry, too, the physical inheritance of those 2 mornings in August. Research on the descendants of atomic bomb survivors continues, and his family remains part of that living history. On the historical level, Yamaguchi's case is unique and irreplaceable. He is the only person in official Japanese government records recognized as having survived both atomic bombings. His case is a singular data point that will remain so forever. On the scientific level, his survival contributed to the body of medical knowledge about radiation exposure and its effects on the human body. The research conducted on atomic bomb survivors forms the foundation of much of what we know today about the biological impact of ionizing radiation. On the political level, his testimony contributed to the global conversation about nuclear weapons and disarmament. He was not a diplomat. He was a man who had been there, who had felt the heat and survived the blast and walked through the ruins and lived with the consequences for 80 years. His testimony carried a moral authority that no theoretical argument about nuclear strategy can match. The most important part of his legacy is the understanding he placed in the minds and hearts of everyone who heard his story, that nuclear weapons are not abstractions, that they fall on cities where ordinary people are living ordinary lives on ordinary mornings, that they burn skin, rupture eardrums, make shadows out of human beings, poison bodies from the inside over decades, that their cost is not paid in the instant of the explosion, but in the entire lifetime of every person close enough to survive. Yamaguchi knew all of this not because he had read about it, but because he had lived it, twice. We made you a promise at the beginning of this video. We told you that at the end, you would hear the one thing Tsutomu Yamaguchi said before he died. The thing that stopped a room full of people completely silent. You stayed, so here it is. But first, sit with everything we have just traveled through together. The burns, the radiation, the nightmares, the silence, the government that refused to believe him, the 64 years of waiting, the wife who suffered, the children who grew up in the shadow of 2 atomic bombs, the old man who finally stood up and spoke when he had almost run out of time. The opening question, what would you do if the world ended twice and both times you walked away, was not big enough for what this man actually lived. What he lived was beyond drama, beyond statistics, beyond the clean, comfortable distance of historical facts. It was something raw and human and specific that resists being packaged into any form that makes it fully digestible. And yet he tried. For the last years of his life, he tried to make people feel it, not because he wanted sympathy, not because he wanted fame. He tried because he was afraid. He was a 93-year-old man dying of cancer in a world still bristling with nuclear weapons, and he was afraid for everyone else. For the generations living their ordinary lives in ordinary cities, with no idea what a nuclear weapon actually does when it falls on a place where people are going about their mourning. He was afraid the world would forget, that the distance of time would turn the atomic bombings into abstract history, that the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, written in the most terrible ink imaginable, written in human suffering, would be lost on the people who needed to learn them most. So he spoke. And what he said, in one of his final public statements before his death, was this. He said that the only people who should be allowed to produce nuclear weapons are the people who have seen with their own eyes what they do. Because if the people making the decision to build these weapons had to first stand inside the blast radius of one, if they had to feel the heat on their skin, if they had to walk through the ruins, if they had to watch the people they love suffer the slow, invisible damage of radiation over decades, if they had to carry the weight of survival for 80 years, then he said there would be no nuclear weapons, because no one who had truly seen it would ever choose to build it. That was his message, simple, devastating, unanswerable. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a speaker to finish, the real quiet. The kind that falls over people when something true has been said out loud in a way that leaves no room for argument. Nobody had a response, because there is no response. He was right. He was simply, completely, and devastatingly right. And he had earned the right to say it in a way that nobody else alive could claim. Think about what it meant that one man carried all of this for so long. The nightmares he never told anyone about for decades. The mornings when the first thing in his mind was the white flash. The years he spent walking around Nagasaki, his city, his home, knowing he had survived something that killed tens of thousands of his neighbors. And then think about what it took to finally say out loud in public to the world, "This is what I saw. This is what it cost. This is what you need to know." That took courage. Not the loud, dramatic courage of a battlefield. The quiet, persistent courage of a private man stepping into public light in the final chapter of his life, because he believed it was the right thing to do. He decided his survival had to mean something. Out of the chaos and the trauma and the loss and the silence, he chose meaning. He chose purpose. He chose to turn the most terrible experience in human history into something that might, just might, make the world slightly less likely to repeat it. We do not know if it worked. The world still has nuclear weapons. The conversations about disarmament are still complicated and slow, but he tried. He stood up in his old age and his damaged body, with his failing eyes and his scarred skin and his lifetime of carried grief, and he tried. So here is the question we want to leave you with. A real one, worth sitting with after the video ends. If Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a man who had every reason in the world to close himself off from the world that had done what it had done to him, if he could find the courage to open up and speak and try to make something meaningful out of the most terrible experience imaginable. What does that say about the rest of us? What does it say about the things we are staying silent about? The truths we know, but are not saying because the timing is not right, or we have been waiting so long that speaking now feels pointless. Yamaguchi waited 60 years, and then he spoke, and it mattered. It is never too late to say the true thing. He survived 2 atomic bombs. He outlived the war that produced them. He outlived his government's willingness to believe him. He outlived his own silence. He died at 93 in the city where he was born, surrounded by the family he had built and kept and loved through everything. And he left behind a message written not in words, but in the entire shape of his life. That human beings are more resilient than the worst things that happen to them. That survival, real survival, not just breathing but continuing to be fully human, is possible even after the most unsurvivable things. That meaning can be made from suffering, not by pretending it did not happen, but by refusing to let it be the only thing that happened. He reached you, right now, across everything. He reached you. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He was born in Nagasaki in 1916. He survived Hiroshima. He survived Nagasaki. He survived the silence and the stigma and the disbelief and the cancer and the loss of his wife and the slow diminishment of his body. He survived all of it. And then he made sure his survival meant something. That is his story, and now it is part of yours.